There is a mansion in California's Santa Ynez Valley that does not belong to the bright, cheerful empire it was built to celebrate. It sits silent on 554 acres of scorched grass and brown hills, surrounded by fences that once kept the world out and now keep only memories in. The main house rises on an elevation like a watchtower, its panoramic windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. This estate was built by Raymond Albert Kroc, the man who fed the world hamburgers and French fries, who turned Two Brothers' small restaurant into a global colossus, who had everything capitalism could offer except the one thing that mattered. This is the story of the J&R Double Arch Ranch, not the sanitized corporate legend you might know from business school case studies or Hollywood biopics, but the darker, stranger truth of how a paper cup salesman became a billionaire, built a palace in the wilderness, and discovered that all the land and luxury in California could not fill the void inside him. The house stands today as a monument to a particular kind of American tragedy, the kind where winning looks exactly like losing, where success tastes like ashes, where the castle becomes a cage. We are going to walk through those gates. We are going to enter the rooms where Ray Kroc lived his final years. We are going to see what happens when ambition builds without limits, when love tangles with control, when the man who standardized happiness for millions could not manufacture it for himself. If you value deep investigations into American power, the hidden costs of empire building, and the invisible hands that shape the world we eat in, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now let us begin where all monuments begin, with the dirt, the hunger, and the relentless drive of a man who refused to disappear. 1. The traveling salesman who would not stay down. Raymond Albert Kroc was born in October 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois, to Czech immigrant parents who had precisely nothing to give him except the understanding that the world was not built for people like them. His father worked for a telegraph company. His mother taught piano. Young Ray learned early that comfort was temporary, that security was an illusion, that the only thing you could rely on was your own stubborn refusal to quit. This is crucial. To understand the ranch, you must understand the man. And to understand the man, you must understand the decades of humiliation that forged him. At 15, Ray lied about his age to become a Red Cross ambulance driver in World War I. He never saw combat. The war ended before his unit shipped out, but during training he met another young dreamer named Walt Disney. 2 boys, 2 futures. Disney would go on to build a kingdom of fantasy. Kroc would build a kingdom of fat and salt. But in 1917, they were just teenagers trying to escape the narrowness of their lives. After the war, Ray returned to a country that did not need him. He tried music. He played piano in Chicago jazz clubs, smoky rooms where the liquor was illegal and the tips were scarce. He was competent but not brilliant. He could keep time, hit the right keys, but he lacked the spark that separates a player from an artist. Music did not want him. So he sold. He sold paper cups for the Lily Tulip Cup Company. He sold real estate during the Florida land boom of the 1920s, that beautiful bubble of speculation and sunshine that popped and left thousands broke. He sold ribbon for a typewriter company. And then, for nearly 2 decades, he sold multi-mixers, heavy, clunky machines that could make 5 milkshakes at once. He traveled, constantly. Cheap motels, long drives, diner food, rejection. The word no became the soundtrack of his existence. 30 years. Think about that. 30 years of being nobody. 30 years of watching other men succeed while you carry sample cases and sleep in your car. 30 years of your wife asking when things will get better and not having an answer. This was not character building. This was character deformation. It created in Ray Kroc a hunger that could never be satisfied, a paranoia that never slept, a need to prove himself that bordered on psychosis. He was not just ambitious. He was damaged. And that damage was the engine that would later power everything: the franchises, the lawsuits, the ranch, the isolation. By 1954, Ray Kroc was 52 years old. His first marriage was crumbling. His body was beginning its slow rebellion, arthritis in his joints, diabetes lurking in his blood. He had a closet full of cheap suits and a mind full of rage. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Then, in the summer of that year, he noticed something odd in his order records. A small restaurant in San Bernardino, California, had purchased 8 of his multi-mixers. 8. Most restaurants bought 1, maybe 2. 8 meant this place was making 40 milkshakes at a time. Either they were insane or they had figured something out. Ray Kroc got in his car and drove west. What he found in San Bernardino would change everything, not just his life, the world. 2. The brothers who built the machine. Ray stole. The McDonald brothers, Richard and Maurice, were not visionaries in the way we use that word now. They were practical men who had stumbled onto something extraordinary through trial and error. They had opened their first restaurant in 1940, a standard drive-in with car hops and a menu of 25 items. It was successful enough, but the brothers were not satisfied. They saw inefficiency everywhere, too much waste, too much complexity, too many workers with too many opportunities to make mistakes. In 1948, they did something radical. They closed the restaurant, fired the car hops, stripped the menu down to 9 items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, fries, shakes, soft drinks, coffee, milk, and pie, and reorganized the kitchen like an assembly line. Every burger was identical, exactly 1.6 ounces of beef, 2 pickles, a dab of ketchup and mustard. No modifications, no exceptions. The kitchen became a machine with human parts. It worked spectacularly. The brothers could serve a burger in 30 seconds. The food was cheap and consistent. Families loved it. Workers on lunch breaks loved it. The McDonald brothers had accidentally invented fast food as a system, not just a business. But they had no interest in expansion. They were making $200,000 a year, roughly $2 million in today's money. And that was enough. They liked their life in California. They had franchised a few locations, but without enthusiasm. The American dream for them was not conquest. It was comfort. Ray Kroc looked at their operation and saw something else entirely. He saw infinity. He saw a model that could be replicated in every town, every city, every highway exit in America. He saw what the brothers could not, that this system was worth more than gold. He made them an offer. He would become their franchise agent. He would handle all expansion. They would collect a percentage. The brothers, wary but intrigued, agreed. In 1955, Ray Kroc opened his first McDonald's franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was 53 years old and starting over. The next few years were chaos. Ray poured everything he had into the business. He mortgaged his house. He borrowed from everyone who would lend. He worked 18-hour days, visiting franchisees, enforcing standards, fighting with suppliers. The McDonald's Corporation was not making money yet. The brothers' contract ensured they took the lion's share. But Ray could see the future. He just had to survive long enough to reach it. By 1961, Ray was done playing by the brothers' rules. The business was taking off, but he was still just their agent, their employee. He wanted ownership. He wanted control. He wanted his name on the empire, not theirs. He offered to buy them out. The brothers named their price, $2.7 million. An astronomical sum. Ray did not have it. He went to investors, put together financing, and on a spring day in 1961, he wrote the check that would sever the McDonald's name from the McDonald's brothers forever. His hands shook as he signed, not from fear, from rage. He hated that he had to pay them at all. The contract included one final humiliation: the original San Bernardino restaurant, the very first McDonald's, could not be part of the deal. The brothers insisted on keeping it. Ray agreed, then spent years seething. Eventually, he opened another McDonald's a block away from the brothers' original location and drove them out of business. He erased them, literally and symbolically. This is the man who would build the J&R Ranch, a man who saw betrayal as strategy, a man who could smile while cutting your throat, a man who believed that winning meant someone else had to lose. But in 1961, he was still just rich on paper. The stock had not gone public yet. He was living in a modest house, driving a modest car, and still working insane hours. He was a millionaire who lived like he was broke because he remembered being broke. And that memory was a wound that never healed. Then, in 1965, the company went public. McDonald's stock exploded. Overnight, Ray Kroc transformed from wealthy to spectacularly, obscenely, almost incomprehensibly rich. He was 63 years old. Most men his age were thinking about retirement. Ray Kroc was thinking about monuments. 3. The woman who gave the ranch, its name and its soul. But before we can enter the physical space of the ranch, we need to meet the other half of its name, the J in J&R, Joan Beverly Mansfield, the woman without whom the ranch would have been just another piece of real estate, another tax shelter for a bitter old millionaire. Joan was the one who transformed Ray's rough ambition into something that could be called, if you squinted, a life. They met in 1957 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Ray was 55, married, and in town on business. Joan was 29, married, and playing the Hammond organ at the Criterion restaurant. The moment he walked into that room and heard her play, something in him shifted. This was not a casual attraction. This was obsession. Joan was everything Ray was not. She had grace. She had poise. She moved through social situations with an ease that Ray, no matter how much money he made, could never replicate. She was educated, cultured, beautiful. She represented the class of people who had always looked down on him, and he wanted her the way a starving man wants bread. The problem was, they were both married. Ray to Ethel, his first wife, the woman who had endured 30 years of his failures. Joan to Raleigh Smith, a McDonald's franchisee. The geometry of the situation was almost comedic in its cruelty. Ray was technically Raleigh's boss. He was sleeping with his franchisee's wife. This was not romance. This was psychological warfare disguised as love. For years, they conducted an affair. Not hidden exactly. Ray was too arrogant to be discreet, but not public either. They met in hotels. They called each other late at night. Ray sent flowers and gifts and made promises. Joan waited. In 1961, Ray finally divorced Ethel. But instead of marrying Joan immediately, he married another woman, Jane Dobbins Green. The marriage lasted 4 years and was, by all accounts, a disaster. Ray was incapable of fidelity. He was still obsessed with Joan. Jane was a placeholder, a mistake, a detour. Finally, in 1969, after more than a decade of waiting, Joan and Ray were both free. They married in a ceremony that felt less like a wedding and more like a corporate merger. Ray was 66. Joan was 41. The age gap was significant, but Joan was not naive. She knew exactly who she was marrying, a ruthless, brilliant, difficult man who would give her access to a world most people could not imagine. And in return, Ray got his prize, his trophy, his proof that the paper cup salesman had finally made it. The marriage changed Ray's position in society. Before Joan, he was nouveau riche, rich but coarse, powerful but unrefined. With Joan, he gained a veneer of respectability. She taught him how to host dinners, how to speak to politicians, how to dress, how to move through the upper echelons of American society without looking like he had just walked off a used car lot. But more importantly, Joan gave Ray the ranch its identity. It was her taste that softened his brutal functionality. It was her vision that turned a piece of land into a statement. The ranch was supposed to be their Eden, their refuge from the chaos of the empire, a place where they could finally be just Ray and Joan, not the king and queen of hamburgers. Of course, it did not work out that way. It never does. 4. 554 acres of control. In 1965, flush with McDonald's, IPO money, and desperate to prove he had arrived, Ray Kroc began looking for land. Not in Los Angeles, where the old Hollywood money sneered at fast food fortunes. Not in San Francisco, where the tech and finance elite already had their hierarchies established. He looked north to the Santa Ynez Valley, a stretch of California that still felt like the Old West. Cowboys, ranches, wide open spaces where a man could see for miles. This was intentional. Ray did not want to live next to people who would judge him. He wanted to be somewhere he could be king without competition. Somewhere the land itself would confirm his dominance. He found a property that suited his ambitions perfectly. 554 acres running through the valley, a mix of flat pasture and rolling hills, with a high point that offered panoramic views. He bought it for a sum that, today, would be worth tens of millions of dollars. And then he started building. The vision was totalizing. This was not going to be just a house. It was going to be a compound, a headquarters, a statement in stone and glass and expensive wood. Ray hired architects and designers and told them what he wanted: space to entertain 100 people, kitchens capable of feeding an army, conference rooms for business meetings, views that never ended. The main structure, eventually called the Lodge, was over 17,000 square feet. To put that in perspective, the average American home at the time was about 1,500 square feet. Ray's house was more than 10 times that. The lodge included a massive great room with a fireplace you could walk into, a dining area that could seat 100 guests, and a commercial-grade kitchen that looked like it belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant, not a private home. But Ray was not building a home. He was building a cathedral to himself. The kitchen is worth lingering on because it reveals so much. Stainless steel everywhere, industrial equipment, professional-grade ovens, and grills. This was where Ray, even in retirement, tested products. He would stand in that cold, gleaming space, frying patties, adjusting recipes, obsessing over the exact temperature and timing that would produce the perfect McDonald's burger. He could not stop working. Even here, in his sanctuary, he was on the clock. There were other buildings, too. The library, officially called the Founders Building, was designed to make Ray look like a man of learning. Shelves lined with medical books. His brother Bob was involved in diabetes research, and Ray funded it heavily. Expensive art on the walls, leather chairs, the aesthetic of intellect. But behind one of those wooden panels was a hidden bar stocked with early times bourbon, the cheap whiskey Ray had drunk since his days as a broke pianist. He was playing the part of the refined gentleman, but he still craved the rough comfort of his youth. And then there was the roundhouse, built in 1971, perched on top of the hill like a fortress. This was Ray's true throne room. The structure was circular, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering 360-degree views of the entire property. From here, Ray could see everything. The lakes he had dug and stocked with black and white swans, Joan's idea, a symbol of duality and balance. The stables, the helicopter pad, the miles of fencing that marked the boundary of his kingdom. The interior of the roundhouse was pure 1970s excess. Orange and brown dominated, deep shag carpets, curved furniture, a massive central fireplace, and everywhere, carved into the wood, cast into the metal, woven into the fabric, the initials J&R. This was branding as obsession. Ray had spent his career building a logo, and now he had turned his own marriage into one. The golden arches were replaced by interlocking letters, but the impulse was the same. Mark the territory. Claim ownership, make sure everyone knows who is in control. The bedroom in the roundhouse was designed with almost pathological intentionality. The bed sat on a raised platform facing east so the sunrise would wake Ray every morning. At night, the windows that offered those stunning views turned into black mirrors, reflecting back his aging face. Ray was surrounded by beauty, but what he saw most often was himself, and what he saw was not comforting. The ranch was also a marvel of logistics. There was a sophisticated intercom system connecting every building, a helicopter pad for fast arrivals and departures. Ray hated waiting, hated traffic, hated anything that slowed him down. Staff quarters for the small army of workers required to maintain the property. This was not a retreat. This was a military installation disguised as a vacation home. Ray filled the land with toys, horses. Joan loved horses, so he built her stables and filled them with expensive breeds. The artificial lakes were stocked not just with swans, but with fish, perfectly maintained, another system to control. There were walking, trails, riding paths, spaces for entertaining, and a swimming pool that, in the California heat, seemed almost redundant given the vast emptiness surrounding it. But here is the central irony. All this space, all this control, all this carefully managed beauty, and Ray Kroc was still miserable. The ranch was supposed to be freedom, but it became another cage. Just bigger, just more expensive. The man who had spent decades on the road, moving constantly, could not sit still. The man who had built an empire on speed could not slow down. And the woman he had brought to this paradise, the woman whose name was carved into every surface, was about to discover that being queen of an isolated kingdom is just another word for prisoner. 5. The price of paradise was paid in whiskey and rage. The golden years did not last long. They never do. By the mid-1970s, cracks in the facade became impossible to ignore. Ray Kroc, now in his 70s, was not aging gracefully. His body, which had carried him through decades of relentless work, began its final rebellion. Arthritis made his hands shake. Diabetes required constant monitoring. And then came the strokes, small ones at first, warning shots, then bigger ones that left him weakened, confused, dependent. The ranch, which had been built as a monument to his power, became a monument to his decline. The roundhouse, that panopticon on the hill, turned into a watchtower from which he could no longer descend. He sat in his chair, looking out over his 554 acres, watching the swans glide across the water, watching the sun set behind the hills, and feeling absolutely nothing. Joan became his caretaker. The woman he had pursued for over a decade, the woman he had obsessed over and controlled and smothered with his need, now had to bathe him, dress him, manage his medications. This was not the fairy tale she had signed up for. This was duty. And Joan, to her immense credit, performed it without complaint. But the cost was visible in her eyes. The evenings were the worst. Ray would drink, not socially, not for pleasure. He drank to obliterate the silence in his head. Early times bourbon, the same cheap whiskey he had drunk when he was nobody. The irony was almost poetic. A man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sitting in a house filled with expensive art and custom furniture, drinking the same rot gut he had drunk in dive bars 50 years earlier. He could not escape his past. He did not want to. And when he drank, he became cruel. Not physically abusive, Ray was too weak for that by then, but verbally vicious. He lashed out at Joan for imagined slights, for perceived betrayals, for simply existing in a way he could not control. The ranch, with its isolation and its lack of neighbors, became the perfect theater for these domestic horrors. No one could hear. No one could intervene. It was just the two of them, locked in a pas de deux of love and resentment. Ray's jealousy, which had always simmered beneath the surface, became pathological. He accused Joan of infidelity, of plotting to leave him, of staying only for the money. None of it was true, but truth did not matter. Ray's mind was betraying him, eating itself from the inside. The strokes damaged not just his body, but his ability to reason, to trust, to feel anything other than rage and fear. Joan endured. She stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she had made a calculation. She had spent decades building this life, and she was not going to abandon it now, not when the finish line was visible. Ray was dying. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. And when he was gone, Joan would finally be free. Free to make her own choices. Free to define her own legacy. Free to answer the question that had haunted her since the day she said, "I do? What is all this wealth actually for?" But Ray was not done yet. In his lucid moments, he turned his attention to philanthropy. This was partly Joan's influence. She had always been more compassionate than he was, but it was also a desperate attempt to buy redemption. Ray knew, on some level, that he was not a good man. He had destroyed the McDonald brothers. He had abandoned his first wife. He had built an empire on low wages and standardized misery. He wanted to balance the scales. In 1976, Ray founded Operation Kroc, Kroc spelled backward, because even in his charity, he could not resist branding. It was a program to combat alcoholism, funding research and treatment. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Ray Kroc, who destroyed himself with alcohol every single night, was trying to save others from the same fate. It was projection. It was guilt. It was a man screaming into the void, hoping someone would hear him and tell him he was not a monster. He also poured money into diabetes research, into medical programs, into universities. Joan encouraged all of it. She saw the philanthropy as a way to redeem not just Ray's legacy, but her own. She had spent years as the silent partner, the beautiful accessory, the woman who smiled at parties and said nothing of substance. Now she was beginning to see a path forward, a way to take all this dirty money, earned through exploitation, through ruthless competition, through grinding thousands of workers into dust, and transform it into something clean. But Ray resisted. Even as he wrote checks to charities, he could not let go of control. He wanted his name on every building, every program, every plaque. He wanted credit. He wanted history to remember him as a great man, not just a rich one. And Joan, watching him flail and rage and cling to his ego even as his body failed, began to plan for the future. A future without Ray. A future where she could finally do what she wanted. The ranch during these years was a haunted place. Staff who worked there, housekeepers, groundskeepers, cooks, spoke in whispers about the tension. The silence in the roundhouse was oppressive. Meals were eaten without conversation. Ray would sit at the head of the table, staring at his plate, occasionally muttering to himself. Joan would sit across from him, her face a mask of patience, her mind elsewhere. Guests came less and less frequently. The parties stopped. The corporate retreats ended. The ranch, which had been designed as a stage for Ray's triumph, became a mausoleum for his decay. The swans still swam in the lakes, the horses still grazed in the fields, but the life had drained out of the place. It was a beautiful corpse, waiting for burial. And on January 14th, 1984, at the age of 81, Raymond Albert Kroc finally died. A heart attack, sudden and final. He was in the roundhouse looking out over his property when it happened. His last view was of the land he owned, the empire he built, the paradise he could not enjoy. And then, nothing. Joan was alone, 60 years old, richer than she had ever imagined, and free for the first time in her adult life to make her own decisions. What she did next shocked everyone. 6. The widow who chose redemption. Over dynasty. The morning after Ray died, the ranch fell into an eerie stillness. No more shouting, no more drunken tirades, no more intercom crackle, with Ray's demands. Just silence. Joan Kroc stood in the roundhouse, looking out at the same view Ray had obsessed over, and felt nothing but exhaustion. She had spent the last decade caring for a man who had given her everything and nothing. She was worth approximately $500 million, roughly $1.5 billion in today's money, and controlled a fortune that would only grow. McDonald's was not just successful, it was invincible. Every quarter, the dividends rolled in. Every year, the stock climbed. Joan was one of the richest women in America. And she hated it. Not the money itself, the source. The whole empire was built on fat and salt and underpaid labor. It was built on Ray's ruthlessness, his willingness to crush anyone who stood in his way. Joan had been complicit, of course. She had enjoyed the benefits. But now, looking at the empty ranch, at the miles of fencing and the artificial lakes and the initials carved into the walls, she saw it for what it was. A monument to ego. A shrine to a man who had everything except peace. She made a decision. She would not be a custodian of Ray's legacy. She would not spend the rest of her life managing his empire and preserving his memory. She would do something he never could. She would give it all away. But first, the ranch. Joan looked at the property and saw potential for transformation. The land was beautiful. The facilities were world-class. What if, instead of being a private kingdom for one billionaire, it became a refuge for people who actually needed it? She conceived a plan. Turn the J&R Ranch into a camp for children with cancer. A place where sick kids could ride horses, swim in the lakes, sleep under the stars, and forget, even for a moment, that their bodies were betraying them. It was brilliant. It was compassionate. It was the perfect way to redeem the house. She would call it Ronald McDonald Camp, using the corporate mascot, but stripping away the cynicism, turning the clown into something genuinely helpful. Joan hired architects and planners. She spoke with medical professionals. She was ready to move forward. And then the neighbors revolted. The same California elite that Ray had never quite fit into. The ranchers and landowners and old money families who had tolerated the Krocs but never embraced them came together in opposition. They did not want buses full of sick children driving through their valley. They did not want the noise, the traffic, the disruption. They were polite about it, of course. They couched their objections in concerns about zoning and environmental impact and property values. But the message was clear. We do not want them here. Joan fought. She made appeals. She offered compromises. But the resistance was immovable. These were people who had spent their lives protecting their enclaves, their views, their isolation. A children's cancer camp was too real, too messy, too human for their carefully manicured world. Ray had spent decades trying to break into their circles. Joan was discovering that even vast wealth could not buy compassion from people who had none to sell. Finally, defeated and disgusted, Joan gave up on the ranch. In 1990, 6 years after Ray's death, she sold it. The buyer was Gerald Kessler, a vitamin magnate, another self-made millionaire. Kessler, perhaps sensing the weight of the place, made an odd choice. He did not change anything. He kept the furniture, kept the decor, kept the initials. The ranch became a time capsule, frozen in 1984, a museum of the 1970s that no one visited. For Joan, the sale was liberating. She was done with the ranch, done with the past, done with the physical reminders of Ray's ego. She took her fortune and began what can only be described as one of the most aggressive philanthropic campaigns in American history. First, she went after causes Ray would have hated: nuclear disarmament. Joan poured millions into anti-war organizations, into movements advocating for peace. Ray had been a cold warrior, a patriot in the most conservative sense. Joan became his opposite. She gave $15 million to National Public Radio. Public radio, the domain of liberals and intellectuals, the exact kind of people Ray had spent his life resenting. Joan loved it. Every check she wrote was a middle finger to her dead husband's worldview. She funded AIDS research in hospices, causes that were still controversial in the early 1990s, that required courage to support. She gave to universities, to medical research, to programs helping the homeless. And then, in 1998, she made the donation that would define her legacy. $80 million to the University of San Diego to found the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. Not a business. School. Not a shrine to capitalism. An institute for peace. But Joan was not done. In 2003, shortly before her own death, she made the largest single donation in Salvation Army history. $1.5 billion. Not million. Billion. With a B. The money was used to build community centers across the country, places where poor families could access resources, education, and support. Places that had nothing to do with hamburgers or golden arches or corporate branding. Joan Kroc died in October 2003 at the age of 75. She had given away nearly $3 billion. She had transformed the McDonald's fortune from a symbol of capitalist ruthlessness into a force for public good. She had redeemed the money by refusing to hoard it. But what about the ranch? What happened to the 554 acres that Ray had built as his monument? It changed hands. Kessler died. New owners came and went. The property was listed, unlisted, listed again. The asking price fluctuated. $29 million, then lower, then off the market entirely. The problem was simple. No one knew what to do with it. The ranch was too specific, too personal, too haunted by Ray Kroc's ghost. It was not a blank canvas. It was a finished painting that no one wanted to hang in their home. The roundhouse still stands. The initials are still carved into the wood. The orange carpets have faded, but are still there. The industrial kitchen in the lodge gathers dust. The lakes, unmaintained, have begun to choke with algae. The swans are long gone, the fences sag, the grass grows wild. The J&R Ranch is not abandoned in the technical sense. There is still minimal maintenance, still security to keep trespassers out, but it is abandoned in spirit. It is a monument without a purpose, a cathedral to a god no one worships anymore. Ray wanted immortality. He wanted his name to echo through history. Instead, he got this: a beautiful, empty, forgotten house in a valley where the wind is the only visitor. 7. What the house teaches us about wealth and emptiness. The story of the J&R Double Arch Ranch is not really about real estate. It is about the limits of wealth, about the things money can and cannot buy, about the difference between legacy and memory, between building monuments and building meaning. Ray Kroc's life is often taught in business schools as a case study in entrepreneurial success. Look at what he built. Look at the empire. Look at the efficiency and the branding and the global reach. But the ranch tells a different story, a darker story, a truer one. Ray spent his entire life chasing respect. He wanted to be seen as more than a burger salesman. He wanted to be acknowledged as a visionary, a titan, a man who mattered, so he built the ranch. He put his initials everywhere. He hosted parties for politicians and celebrities. He donated to charities and founded institutes. He did everything you were supposed to do to secure a legacy, and it did not work. Today, when people think of McDonald's, they do not think of Ray Kroc. They think of the clown. They think of the fries. They think of childhood birthday parties or late-night drunk food or the guilty pleasure of a Big Mac. Ray's name appears in history books and corporate lore, but he is not beloved. He is not celebrated. He is, at best, acknowledged. At worst, he is seen as a thief who stole the McDonald's brothers' idea and crushed them under his heel. The ranch was supposed to change that. It was supposed to be proof that Ray was more than a salesman, that he had taste and vision and deserved to be remembered as great. Instead, it became proof of the opposite. It showed that no amount of money, no amount of land, no amount of control over the horizon could fill the hole inside him. He built a paradise and lived in hell. He surrounded himself with beauty and felt nothing but rage. Joan's story is the inversion. She took the same fortune, the same tainted money, and used it to erase Ray's legacy, not out of spite, though there may have been some of that, but out of a genuine desire to do good. She saw wealth as a responsibility, not a trophy. She understood that money in the end is just a tool. What matters is what you build with it. And what she built was not monuments to herself, but systems of care, community centers, peace institutes, cancer research, AIDS hospices. She built things that would outlast her name. The ranch, empty and silent, is the physical manifestation of this lesson. It is what happens when you try to build meaning out of ego, when you confuse size with significance, when you think that owning the view is the same as appreciating it. Ray could see every inch of his 554 acres from the roundhouse, but he could not see what mattered. He could not see that the land did not care who owned it. The swans did not care. The hills did not care. History did not care. And neither do we. The average person has never heard of the J&R Ranch. They have never thought about where Ray Kroc lived or what his house looked like. They just want their fries hot and their burger fast. The empire continues without him. McDonald's serves billions. The stock climbs. The franchises multiply. And Ray Kroc, the man who made it all possible, is a footnote. But here is the strange part. Joan, who gave everything away, who refused to hoard or control or dominate, is remembered more warmly. Not by everyone, not in the corporate histories, but by the people whose lives she changed. The kids who went to her community centers, the students who studied at her institutes, the researchers who got her grants. They remember Joan Kroc not as a billionaire, but as a benefactor, not as a widow who inherited a fortune, but as a woman who used it wisely. The ranch, then, is a monument to a very specific kind of American failure, the failure of believing that wealth equals worth, that size equals significance, that you can buy your way into history. Ray Kroc built his palace in the California hills and discovered, too late, that palaces are prisons. That isolation is not peace. That control is not freedom. He spent 50 years fighting to stop being invisible, and in the end, the house he built to prove he mattered has become invisible too. It sits, quiet and forgotten, waiting for someone to care, and no one does, except us. We are here, walking through these empty rooms, looking at the faded carpets and the carved initials and the dusty industrial kitchen. We are here because the story of this house is a warning, a reminder, a lesson written in stone and glass and expensive wood. Be careful what you build. Be careful what you chase. Be careful, above all, that you do not spend your entire life constructing a monument to yourself only to discover in the final hours that you built a tomb. 8. The Ghost in the Roundhouse. If you were to visit the J&R Ranch today, which you cannot because it is private property and heavily gated, you would feel it immediately. Not just the emptiness, the weight, the sense that this place is holding on to something it cannot let go of. The roundhouse, in particular, feels less like a building and more like a monument to unfinished business. Stand in the center of that circular room. Look out at the 360-degree view. The valley stretches in every direction, brown and gold and endless. The light is harsh. The air shimmers. You can see for miles, but there is nothing to see. Just land, just silence, just the faint hum of wind through the glass. Ray Kroc stood in this exact spot thousands of times. He watched the sun rise and set. He watched storms roll in from the coast. He watched his empire grow from phone calls made on the intercom system. He watched Joan move through the house, always just out of reach. He watched himself age in the black mirrors of the windows at night. And what did he feel? We can only guess. But the architecture gives us clues. The roundhouse is a panopticon, a structure designed for total surveillance. Ray wanted to see everything. He wanted to know everything. He wanted to control everything. This is not the architecture of peace. This is the architecture of paranoia, of a man who cannot trust the world, cannot trust other people, cannot even trust himself to relax. The initials carved everywhere, J&R, 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 are not romantic. They are desperate. They are the marks of a man who knows, on some level, that he is already disappearing, that the world is moving on without him, that his name, no matter how many buildings it is carved into, will eventually be forgotten. So he carves it again, and again, and again, as if repetition could create permanence. But it cannot. The wood will rot, the metal will rust, the glass will shatter, and the land, indifferent and eternal, will outlast all of it. The ranch is a haunted place, not because ghosts walk its halls, though, if they did, Ray's would certainly be among them, but because it is haunted by the absence of meaning. It was built for a purpose that was never fulfilled. It was supposed to be a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where Ray could finally rest. But Ray could not rest. He did not know how. And so the house became a stage for his final act, the slow, painful, humiliating decline from titan to invalid. Joan must have felt the weight of this place even more acutely. She lived here longer than Ray did. She watched him deteriorate. She endured his rage, and when he finally died, she must have walked through these rooms and felt nothing but relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that she was free. Relief that she could finally leave. And she did leave. She sold the ranch and never looked back. She spent the rest of her life erasing Ray's legacy, transforming his empire into something that might, in some small way, justify the cost at which it was built. She succeeded. But the house remains a physical reminder that some things cannot be transformed. Some mistakes are built into the foundation. Some monuments are curses. Today, the J&R Ranch is listed, unlisted, listed again. The price drops. The market shrugs. No one wants to live in Ray Kroc's house. Why would they? It is not a home. It is a museum of failure, a memorial to ambition that ate itself, a 554-acre reminder that the American dream, when pursued without limits, becomes a nightmare. The tragedy is not that Ray failed. He did not. He succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of almost anyone who has ever lived. He built an empire. He became unimaginably wealthy. He achieved everything capitalism promises. The tragedy is that it was not enough, that success did not bring happiness, that wealth did not bring peace, that owning the horizon did not make him feel any less small. And so the house stands, empty, silent, waiting. Not for a new owner, really, though one will eventually come, but for a purpose. For someone to walk through the door and say, "This place has been a monument to ego long enough. Let's turn it into something useful." Maybe it will become a rehab center, maybe a monastery. Maybe it will burn down in a California wildfire, which is probably the most fitting end for a monument to excess. Or maybe it will just stand here forever, slowly decaying, until the roof collapses and the walls crumble and the land reclaims what was always its own. Maybe that is the only ending that makes sense. Nature, indifferent and patient, erasing the last traces of Raymond Albert Kroc's desperate attempt to matter. 9. What we owe to the people who built the Burger King's castle. There is another layer to this story that has been lurking at the edges, unspoken but undeniable. The ranch did not build itself. Ray and Joan did not pour the concrete or hammer the nails or install the glass. The J&R Ranch, like every monument to wealth, was built by people whose names are not carved into the wood. People who were paid, certainly, but whose labor created the physical reality of Ray's dream while they lived in modest homes and drove used cars and worried about their own bills. This is not a new observation. Every palace hides an army of invisible hands. But it matters here because the source of Ray's wealth was, itself, built on the backs of invisible labor. McDonald's succeeded not because of Ray's genius alone, but because of the franchise model, which extracted value from small business owners who took all the risk while the corporation took most of the profit. And because of the workers, teenagers, immigrants, single mothers, who flipped the burgers and salted the fries and smiled at customers for minimum wage. Ray did not invent exploitation. He did not invent low wages or union busting or the logic that treats human beings as interchangeable parts in a machine. But he perfected it. He standardized it. He turned it into a science. And the profits from that system built the ranch, built the roundhouse, paid for the swans and the horses and the helicopter pad. Every brick in that house is mortared with the unpaid overtime of a fry cook. Every window reflects the face of a worker who could not afford to eat at the restaurant they worked in. This is not to say Ray Kroc was uniquely evil. He was not. He was a product of his time, his culture, his class. He believed sincerely in the myth of meritocracy. He believed that he had earned his wealth through hard work and vision. And in a sense, he had. But he also believed that the people who worked for him had not earned more, that their labor was worth exactly what he paid for it, that the market in its infinite wisdom had determined the value of a human hour. And if that value was barely enough to survive on, well, that was not his problem. That was theirs. Joan, to her credit, seemed to understand this in a way Ray never did. Her philanthropy was not just about giving money away. It was about acknowledging that the fortune she inherited was built on a foundation of exploitation, that the wealth was not clean, that it carried with it a debt that could never be fully repaid, but had to be acknowledged. But even Joan's generosity has limits. She gave away billions, yes, but she still lived in comfort. She still had control. She still decided who deserved help and who did not. The workers who built the ranch, who cooked Ray's meals, who cleaned his toilets, who endured his rages, they did not get a say in how the fortune was distributed. They were, once again, invisible. This is the moral complexity at the heart of the story. Ray Kroc was not a cartoon villain. He was a man shaped by systems that rewarded ruthlessness and punished compassion. He did what the system incentivized him to do: extract, expand, dominate. And the ranch is the physical manifestation of that logic. It is a monument not just to Ray's ego, but to the entire structure of American capitalism, which allows one man to own 554 acres while the people who make his life possible cannot afford to own 5. If we are honest, we are all complicit. Every time we buy a burger, we are participating in the system that built the ranch. We are voting with our dollars for a world where convenience is valued more than dignity, where speed is valued more than fairness, where profit is the only metric that matters. The ranch is not just Ray Kroc's failure. It is ours. It is a mirror reflecting back the world we have built and the world we continue to accept. And yet, there is something almost heroic in Joan's choice to give it all away, to refuse to play the game, to say, I will not be a monument, I will not hoard, I will not pretend this money is clean. Her philanthropy was flawed, yes, it was paternalistic, it was incomplete. But it was something. It was an attempt, however imperfect, to break the cycle, to use wealth not as a hammer, but as a tool for repair. The ranch, empty and unloved, is the physical reminder of what happens when we choose the hammer, when we build monuments to ourselves and call it success, when we confuse ownership with meaning, when we forget that the land, the house, the empire, all of it will outlast us. And the only question that matters is, what did we leave behind? Did we make the world better? Or did we just make it louder? 10. The end of the dream. We have walked through every room now. We have seen the lodge with its industrial kitchen and its conference halls. We have seen the library with its hidden bar. We have stood in the roundhouse and looked out at the endless valley. We have traced the initials carved into the wood. We have felt the silence. And now we stand at the gates, looking back at the house one last time. The sun is setting, the light is golden, the hills are beautiful, and the house is empty. This is the end of Ray Kroc's story. Not the empire, that continues, unstoppable, feeding billions, grinding on with the logic of a machine. But the man, the dream, the hope that wealth could buy something other than more wealth. The ranch was supposed to be proof that Ray Kroc mattered, that he was more than a salesman, that he deserved to be remembered. Instead, it is proof that he was human, flawed, desperate, lonely, angry, brilliant, ruthless, and in the end, no different from anyone else who has ever tried to cheat death by building something that will last. The house will not last. The initials will fade. The land will be sold again and again until no one remembers who Ray and Joan were. Until the ranch is just another piece of California real estate, another investment, another line on a balance sheet. But the lesson will remain. The lesson that you cannot buy peace, that you cannot build meaning out of ego, that the only wealth that matters is the wealth you give away, that the only legacy that lasts is the one you build in other people's lives, not in stone and glass. Joan understood this. Too late to save her marriage, too late to save Ray, but in time to save herself. She spent the last years of her life proving that it is never too late to choose compassion over control, generosity over greed, meaning over monuments. Ray Kroc died in the roundhouse, looking out at his empire, feeling nothing but emptiness. Joan Kroc died knowing she had done something good, not perfect, not enough to erase the harm, but something. The ranch stands between these two endings, a monument to one life and a rebuke to the other. A reminder that we all get to choose, every day, every dollar, every decision. Do we build walls or bridges? Do we hoard or share? Do we carve our initials into the world, or do we give the world what it needs? The J&R Double Arch Ranch, silent and forgotten in the Santa Ynez Valley, does not care what we choose. The land is indifferent, the house is empty, the swans are gone, but we are still here, still choosing, still building, still deciding what kind of monument we want to leave behind. Let Ray Kroc's ranch be a warning. Let Joan Kroc's generosity be a guide. And let the silence of the roundhouse remind us that in the end, the only thing that echoes through history is not the size of the house we built, but the size of the life we lived. The gates close behind us. The house disappears into the dusk, and we drive away, carrying the lesson with us. Wealth is a question, not an answer. The only thing that matters is how you respond. You have walked through the empty corridors of the J&R Ranch. You have seen the architectural monuments to ambition, the frozen tableau of 70s excess, the physical manifestation of Ray Kroc's hunger for validation. But there are layers beneath layers, stories within stories that never made it into the corporate hagiographies or the glossy magazine spreads. There are questions that linger in those empty rooms like the smell of old whiskey soaked into expensive wood. Questions about the people who built this monument, about the economic machinery that made it possible, and about what this forgotten palace tells us about the American experiment itself. We return to the Santa Ynez Valley not to repeat what we know, but to excavate what was buried. To understand not just Ray and Joan, but the invisible hands that laid every brick, the financial structures that enabled every extravagance, and the deeper cultural sickness this ranch both reflected and concealed. This is the story beneath the story. The uncomfortable truths about class, labor, and the mythology of self-made success that the shining arches were designed to obscure. The labor question: who actually built paradise? Stand at the edge of the J&R Ranch property and ask yourself a question that Ray Kroc never wanted you to consider. Who built this? Not whose vision was it, not whose money paid for it, but whose actual hands mixed the concrete, laid the stone, installed those panoramic windows in the roundhouse? The construction of the ranch began in earnest in 1970, right at the peak of Kroc's wealth and power. He had just taken McDonald's fully public. The stock was soaring. Money flowed like water from a broken hydrant. But the 554 acres of raw California land do not transform themselves into a palace complex through force of will alone. They transform through labor. Backbreaking, sun-scorched, minimum wage labor. The workers who built the J&R Ranch were overwhelmingly Latino, immigrants and local working-class families from the Santa Ynez Valley. These were men who would never eat inside the lodge they were constructing. They were the same demographic that would later form the backbone of McDonald's kitchen staff across America. People working multiple jobs, sending money home to families in Mexico or Guatemala, living 3 families to a 2-bedroom apartment in Santa Maria. Here is the economic reality that architectural photography carefully crops out of frame. While Ray Kroc was planning conference rooms for 60 people and industrial kitchens with chrome appliances, the men building these dreams were eating lunch from paper bags in the dirt. The wage for construction labor in California in 1970 averaged around $4 per hour. Do the math. A construction worker putting in 50 hours per week and ranch projects demanded overtime was making roughly $200 weekly before taxes. That is $10,400 per year. Meanwhile, Ray Kroc's personal wealth in 1970 exceeded $500 million. The irony is so thick, you could cut it with the trowels these workers used. The fortune that built this isolated paradise came from selling cheap hamburgers to working-class families. The McDonald's model depended entirely on keeping labor costs as low as legally permissible. Kroc was legendary for his opposition to unions, his resistance to wage increases, his insistence that restaurant workers were entry-level employees who should be grateful for any opportunity. And here, in his personal sanctuary, that same philosophy extended to the men laying the foundation of his retreat. There exists no monument on the property to these builders, no plaque, no acknowledgement. Their names do not appear in the architectural records with the same prominence as the designers or landscape architects. They are ghosts in the machine, erased from the narrative of self-made success. This erasure is not accidental. It is structural. The myth of American individualism requires that we see Ray Kroc as a lone genius who willed an empire into existence through determination and vision. To acknowledge the thousands of hands, cooking, cleaning, building, serving, that actually made his wealth possible would be to admit that success is always collective, always extracted from the labor of others, always dependent on systems of inequality. The ranch compound required specialized labor as well. Electricians to wire the complex intercom system, plumbers to install the elaborate water features that fed those artificial lakes, glaziers to set those massive panoramic windows, landscape architects to transform scrubland into manicured lawns. Each trade represented a separate negotiation, a separate opportunity for Kroc to exercise his notorious parsimony. He was known to personally review budgets line by line, questioning every expense, demanding justifications for costs that to him seemed excessive. The general contractor for much of the work was a firm out of Los Angeles, but much of the actual labor was subcontracted to smaller local operations. This multi-tiered structure allowed distance between Kroc's vision and the reality of how that vision was implemented. He could remain insulated from questions about wages, working conditions, or safety protocols. The contractors absorbed those concerns. Kroc simply wrote checks and demanded results. And when workers were injured, as inevitably happened on a construction project of this scale, there is no evidence that Ray Kroc personally intervened or provided support beyond what workers' compensation legally mandated. A man fell from scaffolding during the roundhouse construction in 1971. He survived but suffered permanent back injuries that ended his construction career. His name does not appear in any of the ranch's official histories. He was a cost, an externality, a minor delay in the schedule. This is not to say that Ray Kroc was uniquely cruel. He was typically American. He operated within a system that allowed, that encouraged, this arrangement. The ranch is a monument not just to one man's ambition, but to an economic structure that permits wealth accumulation on this scale, while the people who build and maintain that wealth scrape by on wages that barely cover rent. Walk through the lodge today and you can still see the evidence of craftsmanship, the hand-carved wooden panels, the custom metalwork, the careful installation of those thousands of tiles. These are marks of skill, of pride, of human attention. But the men who left these marks departed when the work was done. They moved on to the next job, the next wealthy client, the next mansion that would erase their contribution from memory. The ranch's beauty is built on this erasure. Its grandeur depends on forgetting. And that forgetting is the foundation of every monument to wealth in America. The franchise empire, how thousands of restaurants paid for one house. To understand the J&R Ranch's true cost, we must trace the flow of capital backward from the Santa Ynez Valley to every McDonald's franchise in America. Because this is where Ray Kroc's architectural ambitions were actually funded, not by selling hamburgers himself, but by extracting a percentage from every franchisee who sold hamburgers under his golden arches. The franchise model that made Kroc rich is both brilliant and brutal in its simplicity. When he took control of McDonald's from the original brothers in 1961, he refined a system that would define American fast food for generations. Franchisees paid an initial franchise fee. By the late 1960s, this had risen to $75,000. But the real genius was the ongoing revenue stream. Kroc demanded that franchisees pay him 4% of gross sales, not profits, sales. Every single burger, every order of fries, every milkshake. Kroc took his cut before the franchisee paid rent, wages, utilities, or themselves. Additionally, McDonald's Corporation, which Kroc controlled, owned the real estate beneath most franchise locations. Franchisees paid rent to McDonald's for the privilege of operating on land the corporation owned. This dual revenue stream, franchise fees plus rent, meant that Ray Kroc profited regardless of whether individual franchise locations succeeded or failed. If a franchisee went bankrupt, McDonald's simply found another desperate entrepreneur to take over the location and start paying again. By 1970, when construction on the ranch began in earnest, McDonald's had approximately 1,500 locations operating across the United States. Do the mathematics. If each location averaged $500,000 in annual sales, a conservative estimate for successful locations, that 4% royalty generated $30 million annually, flowing directly to McDonald's Corporation. Ray Kroc, as the largest shareholder and effective controller of the company, captured the lion's share of this river of cash. Every dollar that went into the ranch's construction, every stone quarried for the fireplaces, every pane of glass in the roundhouse, every tile on the bathroom floors was extracted from this franchise network. Small business owners in Ohio and Florida and Oregon, people who had mortgaged their homes to buy into the McDonald's dream, were unknowingly funding Ray Kroc's personal paradise in California. The franchisees themselves were diverse. Some were former restaurant workers who saw McDonald's as their ticket to ownership. Others were middle-class families investing their savings into what seemed like a guaranteed system. Many were veterans returning from Vietnam, using GI Bill benefits and military discipline to operate these highly regimented restaurants. They believed in the promise: work hard, follow the system, achieve the American dream. What they often found instead was a trap. The McDonald's system was designed to benefit the corporation, not the franchisee. Kroc mandated that franchisees purchase supplies exclusively from approved vendors, many of which had financial relationships with McDonald's Corporation. The margins were thin. Franchisees worked brutal hours, often alongside their employees, to make their monthly numbers. And always that 4% royalty and the monthly rent payment came due. There are stories, hundreds of them, buried in lawsuits and bankruptcy filings, of franchisees who did everything right and still failed, who followed every procedure in the operations manual, who met every cleanliness standard, who smiled through every inspection and still could not make the numbers work. When they failed, McDonald's Corporation took back the location and sold the franchise rights to someone new. The system was designed to be franchisee-proof. Individual operators could fail, but McDonald's would continue. Ray Kroc's personal philosophy exacerbated this dynamic. He genuinely believed that struggle built character. He had spent decades in poverty and failure before McDonald's made him rich. And he seemed to think that this suffering was not just incidental, but necessary. He wanted his franchisees hungry, desperate, willing to sacrifice everything. He did not want comfortable, secure business owners who might question his decisions. He wanted believers, zealots, people who would work themselves to exhaustion to prove worthy of the golden arches. This philosophy extended to his treatment of employees at the franchise level. Kroc actively opposed minimum wage increases throughout the 1970s. He lobbied against labor regulations. He pioneered the use of part-time workers to avoid paying benefits. The McDonald's employment model, high turnover, low wages, minimal training, became the template for the entire fast food industry. And it made Ray Kroc staggeringly wealthy. The ranch in Santa Ynez was the physical manifestation of this extraction. Every luxury, the helicopter pad, the professional kitchen, the Swan Lakes, the 17,000 square feet of living space represented labor value extracted from minimum wage teenagers flipping burgers in Des Moines. It represented franchise fees paid by hopeful entrepreneurs who would never see Kroc's private paradise. It represented a system designed to concentrate wealth at the top while distributing risk and struggle to everyone below. When Ray and Joan entertained guests at the ranch, politicians, business leaders, celebrities, they were performing a kind of financial alchemy. They were transforming the sweat of thousands of underpaid workers into the appearance of cultured leisure. The cheap food that made the fortune was absent from these gatherings. The menus featured expensive wines, catered delicacies, sophisticated cuisine. The association with McDonald's was present only in the subtle architectural detail of the double arch motif. This separation was crucial. The ranch allowed Kroc to imagine himself as something other than the Burger King. Here, he could be a cattle rancher, a Western gentleman, a patron of the arts. The source of his wealth became abstracted, cleaned, made respectable. But the connection remained. Every light that burned in the roundhouse was powered by franchise fees. Every blade of grass on the manicured lawns was watered with the sweat of labor Kroc had systematically devalued. The franchise model continues today, largely unchanged from Kroc's vision. McDonald's remains one of the world's most valuable brands, generating billions in revenue annually. The franchisees, still grinding, still struggling with thin margins and rising costs, remain the system's foundation. And the wealth flows upward, as it always has, accumulating in corporate headquarters and shareholder portfolios. The J&R Ranch stands as a monument to this extraction. Not because Ray Kroc intended it as such, but because that is what it objectively represents, a private palace built on a foundation of collective labor, designed to be seen by as few people as possible, funded by an empire that depended on making wealth creation invisible. The class war that Ray Kroc could not win. Here we arrive at the central tragedy that the architecture of the J&R Ranch cannot conceal. Raymond Albert Kroc spent the last 20 years of his life fighting a class war he could never win. Not because he lacked money. He had more money than he could possibly spend. But because American class structure, particularly in the elite circles of California society, operates on rules that predate capitalism and transcend wealth, Ray Kroc was new money. Not just new, but embarrassingly, obviously, indelibly new. His fortune smelled like grease and onions. It smelled like minimum wage labor and mass production. It smelled, to put it bluntly, like the working class from which he came and which he never truly escaped despite his billions. Old money, the families who built railroads and banking empires, the descendants of mining fortunes and oil barons, recognized Kroc as fundamentally different, not because he was richer or poorer than them, but because his money came from feeding the masses, from serving. This distinction mattered immensely in the social calculus of California's elite. The Santa Ynez Valley, where Kroc built his ranch, was not randomly chosen. This was horse country. This was where old California money retreated to play at being landed gentry. The families here traced their wealth back generations. Their fortunes were sufficiently aged, sufficiently removed from their brutal origins to seem almost natural. A railroad fortune from the 1880s, built on the backs of Chinese laborers who died by the hundreds, somehow seemed more respectable than a hamburger fortune from the 1960s. Time launders money. Distance from the source cleanses it. Kroc's neighbors in the valley included ranchers whose families had held land since Spanish, colonial times, entertainment industry executives whose careers stretched back to Hollywood's golden age, politicians and judges and financial titans whose names appeared on buildings and foundations. These were people who did not need to prove anything. Their status was inherited, assumed, unquestioned. Ray Kroc, by contrast, needed to prove everything. The ranch was his proof. "Look at me," it screamed. "Look at what I built. Look at these acres, this architecture, these resources. I belong. I have arrived. Accept me." But the language of the ranch, its aggressive scale, its nouveau riche ornamentation, its desperate insistence on grandeur, marked it as the work of an outsider. Old money does not need to impress. Old money can afford understatement. The most elite families often lived in houses that appeared modest from the outside, their wealth expressed in subtle details, the quality of materials, the pedigree of the art collection, the casual mention of property holdings. Elsewhere, Kroc's ranch was the opposite. It announced itself. The gates, the buildings, the helicopter pad, the professional kitchen. Every element was designed to impress, which is precisely why it failed to impress the people whose approval Kroc desperately sought. The social dynamics played out in countless small humiliations, invitations to certain gatherings that never arrived, memberships in certain clubs that were quietly denied, conversations that became politely awkward when Kroc mentioned his business, the smile that never quite reached the eyes when old money families congratulated him on his success. Joan, it should be noted, navigated these waters far better than Ray. She had social intelligence and charm. She understood the unwritten rules. But even Joan's skills could not fully overcome the fundamental problem. Ray Kroc was the hamburger man. That identity clung to him like the smell of fryer oil. It defined him in the eyes of the elite, regardless of how many millions he donated or how many politicians he courted. The Valley's reaction to Joan's later attempt to create a camp for children with cancer revealed the depths of this class division. Here was a genuinely charitable proposal. The ranch would serve a humanitarian purpose. Sick children would benefit from the property's beauty and resources. By any reasonable moral standard, the neighboring landowners should have supported this plan. They opposed it viciously. Not because they hated sick children, though their actions suggested they cared more about property values than dying kids, but because they rejected the idea that Kroc's land should serve the masses. The valley was a retreat from the masses. That was its entire purpose. To allow a working-class charitable cause onto this elite real estate would be to admit that the boundaries between classes were permeable. that new money could buy its way into genuine social acceptance, that McDonald's wealth was equivalent to their inherited fortunes. This they could not allow. The vote against Joan's camp was a vote to maintain class boundaries. It was old money telling new money, "You do not belong here. You never will. And when you are gone, we will erase you." Ray Kroc understood this dynamic but could not accept it. His entire self-image was built on the American mythology of meritocracy. He believed that hard work and success should be sufficient for acceptance. He believed that money was money, that wealth should command respect, regardless of its source. He believed in the promises America makes about class mobility and self-invention. The elite of the Santa Ynez Valley taught him otherwise. They taught him that class operates on rules older than capitalism, deeper than money. They taught him that certain doors remain closed regardless of how many times you knock. They taught him that you can buy land but not heritage, that you can build a palace but not pedigree. The psychological toll of this rejection contributed to Ray's deterioration in his final years. The whiskey, the rage, the controlling behavior toward Joan, these were symptoms of a deeper wound. He had conquered the business world. He had built an empire. He had accumulated wealth beyond imagination. And still, he remained the paper cup salesman, the piano player from Chicago, the man who smelled like hamburgers. The ranch could not change this. No amount of architecture could. This is the class war that Ray Kroc could not win. Because it was never really a war. Wars imply two sides with comparable weapons. This was more like a siege, with Ray on the outside of walls that would never open, building monuments that the people inside could not be bothered to notice. When Ray died in 1984, the old money families of the Santa Ynez Valley attended his funeral with appropriate solemnity. They said appropriate words about his achievements and philanthropy. And then they went home to their understated houses and promptly forgot him. The ranch stood as a monument, but monuments to rejected outsiders carry a particular kind of sadness. They testify not to triumph, but to the limits of what wealth alone can achieve. The architecture of control, design as psychological expression, return to the roundhouse, that strange circular building on the hill. Stand in its center where Ray Kroc once stood and understand that you are standing inside a three-dimensional expression of his psychology. Architecture, when examined carefully, never lies about its creator. It cannot. Every choice, materials, layout, sightlines, scale, reveals something fundamental about the mind that conceived it. The roundhouse was completed in 1971 at the height of Kroc's power and the beginning of his physical decline. Its circular design was not merely aesthetic. It was functional in a very specific way: total visibility. From the central living area, Ray could see everything. 360 degrees of glass, no blind spots, no corners where activities could occur unseen. This is panopticon architecture. The concept comes from Jeremy Bentham's prison design, where a central guard tower allows constant surveillance of all cells while the prisoners cannot see the guard. The psychological effect is powerful. Inmates must assume they are always being watched, so they police their own behavior. The roundhouse inverted this slightly. Ray was visible to anyone on the property, but he could also see everything. He was simultaneously guard and prisoner, warden and inmate. Why would a man design his home as a surveillance apparatus? The obvious answer is control. Ray Kroc spent his entire professional life obsessed with standardization and control. Every McDonald's restaurant was designed to be identical. Every burger prepared exactly the same way. Every employee trained to perform identical motions. This was not just efficiency, this was psychological comfort. In a predictable, controlled environment, there are no surprises, no betrayals, no chaos. But the ranch was not a restaurant. It was supposed to be a home, a retreat, a place to relax. The fact that Kroc brought his obsession with control even here, reveals how deeply his anxieties ran. The roundhouse was not designed for relaxation. It was designed to prevent the universe from surprising him. Joan lived in this glass cage, too. Consider what that meant. Every movement visible, every guest noted, every moment of privacy erased. The roundhouse had bedrooms, of course, but even these had panoramic views. The architecture enforced transparency. It made secrecy impossible. For a man as jealous and possessive as Ray Kroc became in his later years, this design was ideal. Joan could not slip away unnoticed. She could not receive visitors without Ray's awareness. The house itself was an extension of his surveillance. It was love expressed as architecture, and what it expressed was suffocating need dressed up as grandeur. The other buildings on the property reinforced this theme. The lodge, with its conference rooms and industrial kitchen, was designed for a performance. Every space anticipated an audience. Ray could not simply cook breakfast. He had to demonstrate his ability to cook breakfast in a professional setting, to standards he could measure and control. He could not simply host friends. He had to orchestrate gatherings with the precision of a McDonald's operating system. The lack of intimate spaces is telling. Where was the cozy study? The personal library with a reading chair? The small, comfortable room where one might sit quietly and simply exist? These spaces did not exist because Ray Kroc could not simply exist. He had to perform, to achieve, to control. Stillness terrified him. The positioning of buildings on the property also speaks volumes. The roundhouse sat at the highest point, overlooking everything. This was not just about views, it was about dominance. The visual hierarchy mirrored the psychological hierarchy. Ray, above, surveying his domain. Everything else below, subject to his gaze. Water features throughout the property. The artificial lakes, the pools, represented attempts to control nature itself. Water in Southern California is precious, scarce, expensive. To dedicate thousands of gallons to ornamental lakes was to assert dominance over the environment. Ray Kroc was telling the land, the climate, the natural order, I am richer than you. I can afford to waste water on swans. I can reshape you to my vision. But nature resists control. Water evaporates. Lakes require constant maintenance. Native vegetation encroaches on manicured lawns. Wildlife ignores property boundaries. The ongoing battle to maintain the ranch against entropy was expensive and exhausting, and ultimately futile. Today, as the ranch sits mostly unused, nature is reclaiming what was briefly taken from it. The grass grows wild. The lakes may be reduced to mud. The architecture remains, but the control it represented has lapsed. This is the fate of all attempts to architecturally encode control. Time wins. Entropy wins. The rigid systems break down. What seemed permanent reveals itself as temporary. The interior design of the ranch, particularly that orange and brown 70s aesthetic that has dated so dramatically, represents another form of control failure. Ray Kroc wanted to create something timeless, but he could only create within his moment. The furniture, the colors, the materials all scream 1970s now. What felt cutting-edge to Ray feels like kitsch to us. His attempt to build something outside of time merely froze his moment in time, allowing us to see exactly how trapped in his era he was. The hidden bar in the library is perhaps the most psychologically rich architectural detail. A secret panel that reveals bottles of whiskey. Why hide it? The ranch was Ray's property. He could drink openly if he chose. No one would judge him, at least not to his face. But the hidden bar suggests shame. It suggests that even Ray Kroc, the man who controlled a global empire, could not fully control his relationship with alcohol. The architecture provided a space for this secret, this weakness, this thing that could not be integrated into the public performance of success. Behind the panel was the real Ray, the addict, the vulnerable human, the man who needed chemical assistance to tolerate his own company. Joan knew about the bar, of course. Staff knew. Guests probably knew. The secrecy was thin, performative. But it allowed Ray to maintain a fiction. You have walked through the empty corridors of the J&R Ranch. You have seen the architectural monuments to ambition, the frozen tableau of 70s excess, the physical manifestation of Ray Kroc's hunger for validation. But there are layers beneath layers, stories within stories that never made it into the corporate hagiographies or the glossy magazine spreads. There are questions that linger in those empty rooms like the smell of old whiskey soaked into expensive wood. Questions about the people who built this monument, about the economic machinery that made it possible, and about what this forgotten palace tells us about the American experiment itself. We return to the Santa Ynez Valley not to repeat what we know, but to excavate what was buried. To understand not just Ray and Joan, but the invisible hands that laid every brick, the financial structures that enabled every extravagance, and the deeper cultural sickness this ranch both reflected and concealed. This is the story beneath. The story. The uncomfortable truths about class, labor, and the mythology of self-made success that the shining arches were designed to obscure. The labor question. Who actually built paradise? Stand at the edge of the J&R Ranch property and ask yourself a question that Ray Kroc never wanted you to consider. Who built this? Not whose vision was it, not whose money paid for it, but whose actual hands mixed the concrete, laid the stone, installed those panoramic windows in the roundhouse? The construction of the ranch began in earnest in 1970, right at the peak of Kroc's wealth and power. He had just taken McDonald's fully public. The stock was soaring. Money flowed like water from a broken hydrant. But the 554 acres of raw California land do not transform themselves into a palace complex through force of will alone. They transform through labor. Backbreaking, sun-scorched, minimum wage labor. The workers who built the J&R Ranch were overwhelmingly Latino, immigrants and local working-class families from the Santa Ynez Valley. These were men who would never eat inside the lodge they were constructing. They were the same demographic that would later form the backbone of McDonald's kitchen staff across America. People working multiple jobs, sending money home to families in Mexico or Guatemala, living 3 families to a 2-bedroom apartment in Santa Maria. Here is the economic reality that architectural photography carefully crops out of frame. While Ray Kroc was planning conference rooms for 60 people and industrial kitchens with chrome appliances, the men building these dreams were eating lunch from paper bags in the dirt. The wage for construction labor in California in 1970 averaged around $4 per hour. Do the math. A construction worker putting in 50 hours per week and ranch projects demanded overtime was making roughly $200 weekly before taxes. That is $10,400 per year. Meanwhile, Ray Kroc's personal wealth in 1970 exceeded $500 million. The irony is so thick, you could cut it with the trowels these workers used. The fortune that built this isolated paradise came from selling cheap hamburgers to working-class families. The McDonald's model depended entirely on keeping labor costs as low as legally permissible. Kroc was legendary for his opposition to unions, his resistance to wage increases, his insistence that restaurant workers were entry-level employees who should be grateful for any opportunity. And here, in his personal sanctuary, that same philosophy extended to the men laying the foundation of his retreat. There exists no monument on the property to these builders, no plaque, no acknowledgement. Their names do not appear in the architectural records with the same prominence as the designers or landscape architects. They are ghosts in the machine, erased from the narrative of self-made success. This erasure is not accidental. It is structural. The myth of American individualism requires that we see Ray Kroc as a lone genius who willed an empire into existence through determination and vision. To acknowledge the thousands of hands, cooking, cleaning, building, serving, that actually made his wealth possible would be to admit that success is always collective, always extracted from the labor of others, always dependent on systems of inequality. The ranch compound required specialized labor as well. Electricians to wire the complex intercom system, plumbers to install the elaborate water features that fed those artificial lakes, glaziers to set those massive panoramic windows, landscape architects to transform scrubland into manicured lawns. Each trade represented a separate negotiation, a separate opportunity for Kroc to exercise his notorious parsimony. He was known to personally review budgets line by line, questioning every expense, demanding justifications for costs that to him seemed excessive. The general contractor for much of the work was a firm out of Los Angeles, but much of the actual labor was subcontracted to smaller local operations. This multi-tiered structure allowed distance between Kroc's vision and the reality of how that vision was implemented. He could remain insulated from questions about wages, working conditions, or safety protocols. The contractors absorbed those concerns. Kroc simply wrote checks and demanded results. And when workers were injured, as inevitably happened on a construction project of this scale, there is no evidence that Ray Kroc personally intervened or provided support beyond what workers' compensation legally mandated. A man fell from scaffolding during the roundhouse construction in 1971. He survived but suffered permanent back injuries that ended his construction career. His name does not appear in any of the ranch's official histories. He was a cost, an externality, a minor delay in the schedule. This is not to say that Ray Kroc was uniquely cruel. He was typically American. He operated within a system that allowed, that encouraged, this arrangement. The ranch is a monument not just to one man's ambition, but to an economic structure that permits wealth accumulation on this scale, while the people who build and maintain that wealth scrape by on wages that barely cover rent. Walk through the lodge today and you can still see the evidence of craftsmanship, the hand-carved wooden panels, the custom metalwork, the careful installation of those thousands of tiles. These are marks of skill, of pride, of human attention. But the men who left these marks departed when the work was done. They moved on to the next job, the next wealthy client, the next mansion that would erase their contribution from memory. The ranch's beauty is built on this erasure. Its grandeur depends on forgetting. And that forgetting is the foundation of every monument to wealth in America. The franchise empire, how thousands of restaurants paid for one house. To understand the J&R Ranch's true cost, we must trace the flow of capital backward from the Ynez Valley to every McDonald's franchise in America. Because this is where Ray Kroc's architectural ambitions were actually funded, not by selling hamburgers himself, but by extracting a percentage from every franchisee who sold hamburgers under his golden arches. The franchise model that made Kroc rich is both brilliant and brutal in its simplicity. When he took control of McDonald's from the original brothers in 1961, he refined a system that would define American fast food for generations. Franchisees paid an initial franchise fee. By the late 1960s, this had risen to $75,000. But the real genius was the ongoing revenue stream. Kroc demanded that franchisees pay him 4% of gross sales, not profits. Sales. Every single burger, every order of fries, every milkshake. Kroc took his cut before the franchisee paid rent, wages, utilities, or themselves. Additionally, McDonald's Corporation, which Kroc controlled, owned the real estate beneath most franchise locations. Franchisees paid rent to McDonald's for the privilege of operating on land the corporation owned. This dual revenue stream, Franchise fees plus rent meant that Ray Kroc profited regardless of whether individual franchise locations succeeded or failed. If a franchisee went bankrupt, McDonald's simply found another desperate entrepreneur to take over the location and start paying again. By 1970, when construction on the ranch began in earnest, McDonald's had approximately 1,500 locations operating across the United States. Do the mathematics. If each location averaged $500,000 in annual sales, a conservative estimate for successful locations, that 4% royalty